Tu Diep. Hello everyone, wishing you all good health and peace in life. CEO James has almost disappeared, leaving behind questions that weigh heavily on Tu Diep's heart. Will he truly keep the promise he once whispered to her, or will time and distance erase it? As Tu Diep sits with his little daughter, sharing their very first meal together, James is not there, but in every bite, every tender glance, his missed day and night, the ache of absence and the hope of reunion blend into a love that refuses to fade. James had always been the kind of man people looked up to, calm, sharp, and endlessly devoted to his work. But behind the polished image of a CEO, he was simply a man holding on to fragile promises. A promise to rebuild his company, a promise to protect the woman he loved, and most of all, a promise whispered to himself that one day he would sit down with Diep and their daughter and share the first meal as a family. That image haunted him, a tender dream that replayed in his mind through every sleepless night. Life had not been gentle with Diep. She was simple, hardworking, and carried the softness of the countryside in every step she took. She sold vegetables at the market, cared for a little girl named Nee with the gentleness of a mother, and waited patiently for James, even when he was buried in chaos. To her, happiness was not luxury cars or golden towers. It was watching a child smile after a warm meal, or hearing James's voice over the phone when he was far away. But storms gathered around James faster than he could control. Betrayal within the company, false accusations, and schemes by old rivals forced him to nearly vanish from Diep's life. There were days when she wondered if his silence meant he had forgotten her. She carried on alone, harvesting, selling, taking care of Nee, yet her heart whispered that he would return, because James was not a man who broke promises. One evening, after a long day at the market, Diep took Nee to eat a simple bowl of noodles. The child's laughter echoed in the small shop, her face glowing with joy. Diep smiled, but her heart ached with the thought that James was missing this moment. He should have been here, watching their daughter struggle with chopsticks, laughing softly as soup dripped on the table. He should have been part of this memory. Instead, James was oceans away, fighting for a company that others were trying to destroy. And yet, even in boardrooms filled with hostile eyes, or in nights when he collapsed from exhaustion, James thought of that scene, the one he hadn't lived yet. He imagined Diep's gentle hands guiding their daughter's spoon, her voice filled with patience. He imagined himself sitting across from them, at peace for once, not as a CEO, but as a father and a man in love. The world could strip him of wealth, reputation, even freedom, but it could never take that promise from his heart. He would return. He would fight his way back, no matter the cost. Because for James, the first meal with his daughter and Diep was not just a dream. It was the life he owed them, the happiness he longed for, and the promise he would keep no matter how many times fate tried to pull him away. Days passed into weeks, and the distance between James and Diep grew heavier than the miles of ocean that separated them. Diep carried the weight of silence with quiet strength, her life revolving around Nee, the little girl who had found shelter in her arms. Every morning, Diep tied her hair back, picked up the woven basket, and led Nee to the fields or the market. She taught the child how to smile at strangers, how to thank every customer, and how to share even when they had little. But in the stillness of night, when the lamps burned low, Diep's thoughts betrayed her. She would sit by the window, looking out at the shadows of the village, and wonder, was James safe? Did he think of her, or had the storms of the corporate world swallowed him whole? James, meanwhile, lived in a different battlefield. The boardroom had turned into a place of daggers hidden beneath polished words. Former allies betrayed him, investors pulled their support, and his name, once synonymous with trust, was dragged through scandal. He wore the mask of control, but inside, He was unraveling. Every deal that collapsed, every sleepless negotiation, brought him closer to breaking. Yet what held him together was not the company, not the empire he had built. It was the promise to Diep. One night, after endless hours of strategy meetings, James finally closed his eyes in the quiet of his office. Exhaustion claimed him, and in his dreams he saw it again: the first meal. Diep's soft smile, the steam rising from bowls of soup, the clumsy yet innocent joy of their daughter learning how to eat on her own. He could almost hear Diep's voice: "Eat slowly, don't burn yourself." He reached out, but the vision dissolved, leaving him with only the cold emptiness of reality. He woke up with tears burning his eyes. Back in the village, Diep tried to protect Nee from her own longing. She laughed when Nee tugged her hand, asking, "When will Uncle James come back?" "He promised to eat with us." Diep forced a smile, brushing the child's hair back. "Soon," she whispered. "He will come back soon." She said it as much to comfort herself as to comfort the little girl. The rain came that night, heavy and relentless. Diep stood outside, pulling in the basket she had left by the wall. Her clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't care. All she could think of was James, somewhere far away, maybe fighting his own storm. Would he truly come back? And at that very moment, James was boarding a plane. His decision had been made. No more running, no more hiding behind business battles. If the empire crumbled, so be it, but he would not allow the promise to Diep to crumble too. He closed his eyes as the engines roared, whispering silently, "Wait for me, Diep. I am coming home." The village morning was alive with the sound of vendors calling, children laughing, and the faint smell of food drifting from small kitchens. Diep woke early, as always, preparing a simple breakfast. For Nee, the little girl, still half asleep, rubbed her eyes and whispered, "Is today the day James comes back?" Diep paused, the spoon in her hand trembling slightly. She forced a smile and bent down to kiss Nee's forehead. "Maybe," she said softly, "maybe today." Yet inside, doubt gnawed at her. She had learned to be strong, but even strength could not silence longing. Far above the clouds, James sat by the window of the plane, watching the sunrise bleed into gold across the horizon. His chest tightened. For so long, every decision he made was for shareholders, partners, and the survival of the empire he had built. But now, for the first time, every mile that passed brought him closer not to victory in business, but to love Tu Diep and to the daughter he had yet to hold at his table. When the plane landed, James felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. Would Diep still be waiting? Would she believe him after all the nights of silence? He carried no entourage, no weight of his CEO title, only a suitcase and a fragile hope. Meanwhile, in the small village, rain clouds gathered again. Diep and Nee were at the market, selling the last of the vegetables. The child's laughter rang out as she helped count coins with her tiny fingers. To anyone else, it was an ordinary day, but Diep's heart felt unusually restless, as if the air itself carried a secret. That afternoon, as they returned home, Nee suddenly shouted, "See Diep. Look." She pointed down the road. A tall figure stood there, suitcase in hand, the wind tugging at his coat. His eyes searched desperately, and when they found Diep and the little girl, they softened with a warmth he had almost forgotten how to feel. James. Diep froze, her breath caught in her chest. For a moment, time stood still. She wanted to run, to cry, to scold him for leaving her in silence so long, but her feet wouldn't move. It was Nee who broke the stillness. She ran ahead, her little arms wide. "Uncle James," she shouted, her voice filled with pure joy. James dropped his suitcase, kneeling to catch the child in his embrace. His hands trembled as he held her. the reality of her small warmth searing through him like fire. Then his eyes lifted, meeting Diep's. The world narrowed until there was only her tired eyes, her quiet strength, her heart that had waited despite everything. He rose slowly, stepping toward her. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "I came back. I kept my promise." Diep felt the tears she had held back for months finally fall. She closed the distance between them, her voice trembling. "Do you know how long I waited, James?" "I know," he whispered, reaching for her hand. "And every second I was gone, I dreamed of this moment, of you, of us." That evening, for the first time, they sat together at a small wooden table. Steam rose from the bowls of noodles Diep had prepared. Nee giggled, spilling broth as she tried to lift noodles with her chopsticks. James laughed softly, his heart aching with joy. He reached across the table, brushing Diep's hand gently. It was not the grand halls of the city, not the banquets of power, but here, in the humble warmth of Diep's home, James finally tasted the meal he had longed for, the first meal with his daughter, and the woman he loved, and in that moment, he knew no empire, no wealth, no power could ever compare to this. The story of James Diep and little Nee teaches us that love and family are treasures far greater than wealth, power, or success. James almost lost himself in the endless battles of business, chasing victories that left him empty at night. Yet, what gave him strength to endure and return was not the empire he built, but the promise of a simple meal with the ones he loved most. Diep's patience shows us the quiet power of loyalty and faith. Even in loneliness, she continued to nurture and protect, proving that true love is not measured by grand gestures, but by small acts of care every day. Nee's innocence reminds us of what really matters: the laughter of a child, the warmth of home, and the simple joy of sharing food together. The lesson is clear. Success means nothing if it costs us the people who wait for us. At the end of the day, promises made in love are sacred, and the greatest victories are not in boardrooms or contracts, but at the dinner table, surrounded by those who love us without condition. In the end, James learned that keeping his promise to Diep was not only about fulfilling his word, it was about choosing love over ambition, presence over absence, and family over everything else. True love and responsibility demand sacrifice. James's journey reminds us that chasing wealth and recognition without balance can cause us to lose sight of what matters most. His absence nearly broke the fragile bond he shared with Diep, but his return proves that it is never too late to choose differently. When we realize the value of the people who wait for us, we must act before it becomes a regret we cannot mend. Diep's role in this story shows another side of love, patience and endurance. She did not give up when days turned into months without James by her side. Instead, she held on to hope, not through words, but through actions, caring for Nee, working hard, and keeping faith alive. From her, we learn that love is not only passion, but also quiet resilience. Nee, the child, symbolizes innocence and the future. Her joy at James's return and her simple dream of sharing a meal together reveal a profound truth. Children do not need riches. They need presence. They measure love in time, attention, and shared laughter. The story teaches us that promises are not just words, they are responsibilities that define who we are. Breaking them weakens trust, but keeping them, even after struggle, builds a foundation of love that can withstand any storm. In life, we often run after things that glitter, but when the noise fades, what truly fills the heart is the warmth of family, the comfort of belonging, and the memory of promises kept.